Hey, my name is Eli Sutton. I'm 30 years old and I fix time for a living, which is a fancy way of saying I repair clocks and watches in a narrow little shop in the city that my Uncle Wallace left me when he died. Grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, cuckoos, wristwatches with movements smaller than a fingernail, the old railway pocket watches that men used to set their whole lives by. People bring me things that have stopped, and I take them apart down to the last jeweled pivot, and I find the one small tired part that gave out, and I make it run again. There is a particular quiet in that work that I have never found anywhere else, a stillness with a heartbeat inside it, and I think I hid in it for a lot of years. Because here is the truth about a man who mends time for everybody else. His own tends to stop without him noticing. I live an hour out of the city in a small town called Alderton, the kind of town that has one of everything and two of nothing, and every night I close the shop and I catch the last train home, the 11:40, the one that runs nearly empty through the dark. Same car, same window seat, same hour of watching my own tired face float over the black glass while the towns go by like dropped coins. Gus punches my ticket. Gus has worked that late run for as long as I've ridden it. A big, gentle man with gray in his mustache and a voice like a cello, and over the years he's become the closest thing I've got to a regular conversation. He knows I take my coffee black from the machine that only sometimes works. He knows I lost my uncle. He knows, though he's never once said so, that I ride that train alone every night of my life and go home to rooms above a shop where the only sound is 100 clocks disagreeing about what time it is. I'd made a kind of peace with all of it. I'd told myself a story about who I was, and the story was this: some men are places you pass through, and some men are places you stay, and I was the first kind. A way station. A lovely place to visit. Somebody had said that to me once, on her way out the door to a bigger life, and I'd taken it and built a whole quiet fortress out of it, and I'd lived in that fortress 6 years. And then on a cold Thursday in November, on the 11:40 out of the city, a woman I had never seen before sat down in the seat beside me, breathing like she'd run for the train, and leaned in close and changed the direction of my entire life with a single whispered question. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Let me set it right. The train was nearly empty, the way it always is that late, a scatter of night shift folks dozing under the cold lights. I had a pocket watch open on my knee, wrapped in a soft cloth, an 1898 railroad watch a widow had brought me that week, her late husband's, stopped for 30 years, and I was turning it in the light, studying the frozen movement the way another man might read on the train. The doors chimed at the last second before departure, and someone came through them fast, and I felt more than saw a person drop into the seat beside me, though the whole car was empty and there was no reason on earth for anyone to sit shoulder to shoulder with a stranger. I looked up. She was maybe 28, with dark auburn hair coming loose from whatever careful thing it had been pinned into hours ago, and she was wearing a deep green evening dress, the kind you wear to a thing that matters, with a thin coat thrown over it that wasn't nearly warm enough for November. Her makeup was faintly smudged under her eyes. She was gripping a small beaded purse in both hands like it was the railing of a ship, and she was looking straight ahead, at nothing, at the black window, and her jaw was set in the particular way of a person holding themselves together by main force. Then she turned and looked at me, and her eyes were the gray of the sky right before it decides to snow, and she said low and quick and mortified, "I am so sorry. I know how this looks. But there is a man about to come through that door, and I need, just for a minute, just until the next stop, I need to not be a woman sitting alone. Do you mind if I pretend we're together? You don't have to do anything. Just don't let me be alone right now. Please, I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. Because I could have said any number of things. I could have frozen, the way I freeze. I could have asked 100 sensible questions. But there was something in her face that I recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting, a person at the exact edge of themselves, and I did the only thing that mattered, which was to make it easy. I closed the pocket watch, and I folded the cloth around it and tucked it in my coat, and I shifted a little toward her like a man settling in with someone he loves. And I said, warm and unhurried, loud enough to carry, "You're freezing. Here," and I took off my coat and put it around her shoulders over her thin one, and I let my arm rest along the back of the seat behind her, not touching, just there, a fence and not a cage. "Better?" I said, quieter, and she let out a breath that seemed to have been 3 hours coming, and she said, "Thank you." And she leaned in against my shoulder just as the door at the end of the car slid open. The man who came through was tall, well-dressed, a good overcoat, a nice scarf, the polished kind of handsome that costs money to keep. He was scanning the seats with the tight patience of a man looking for something that belongs to him. His eyes went down the car, over the sleeping night shift men, and landed on us, on the green dress and the auburn hair, and he started forward, and I felt her go rigid against me. So I did the thing you do. I looked up at him with the mild, faintly annoyed pleasantness of a man whose evening has been interrupted, and I said, "Evening, can I help you find something?" He stopped. He looked at me, at my worn coat around her shoulders, at my arm along the seat, at the easy way she was leaned into me, and I watched him do the arithmetic and come out with the wrong answer, which was the answer we needed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought you were someone I know." "Easy mistake on this train," I said. "Everybody looks like everybody at midnight." He stood a moment longer, uncertain, and then whatever certainty had driven him down the car drained out of him, and he nodded stiffly and turned and went back the way he'd come, and the door slid shut behind him. And Cora Ashby, though I didn't know her name yet, let out a long, shaking breath against my shoulder and started, very quietly, to cry. I didn't say anything for a while. I just let her be, and I gave her back the privacy of pretending I couldn't tell, watching the dark go by, my arm still resting behind her, until the crying eased and she straightened up and wiped under her eyes with the heel of her hand and gave a wet, embarrassed laugh. "Well," she said, "that's the most humiliating thing I've done in front of a stranger in my entire life." "You'd be surprised what I've seen on the 1140, I said. "A man once rode this train in a full night's costume and fell asleep and missed his stop. Chainmail and everything. You're doing fine." That got a real laugh out of her, surprised and bright, and she pressed her hand to her mouth like she'd forgotten she was allowed. "I'm Eli," I said. "Cora," she said, "and I owe you an explanation. Or at least I owe you my coat back, your coat back. Keep it till you're warm," I said. "The explanation's yours to give or keep. You don't owe a stranger your reasons." She was quiet a moment, turning that over. Then she said, looking at the black window, that was Preston, the man. "We got engaged in the spring. Everyone was very happy about it. My mother, his mother, my sister, the whole, everyone. He's a good match. That's the phrase people kept using. A good match, like I was a curtain and he was a sofa. And tonight was the engagement party, the big one, the one with the ice sculpture. And I stood there in this dress holding a glass of champagne, and I looked around the room at my entire future all laid out and agreed upon. And I realized I couldn't feel my own hands, that I'd been saying yes to things for so long that I'd forgotten I was a person who could say no. And I put the glass down on a waiter's tray, and I walked out the side door, and I got in a cab, and I told it to take me to the train station, any train station. And I got on the first train leaving, and that's this one, and I don't even know where it goes. "Alderton," I said. "End of the line. About an hour out." "Alderton," she repeated like tasting it. "I've never heard of it." "Nobody has," I said. "That's the best thing about it." She almost smiled. Then her face crumpled a little again, and she said, "He came after me." "Of course he came after me. He'll have called my sister, and they'll be so worried and so disappointed, and tomorrow I'll have to be sorry, I'll have to explain, I'll have to be the woman who got cold feet and made a scene, and I don't." She stopped and pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth again and said, muffled, "I don't want to go home." Isn't that a terrible thing to say? I have a whole life waiting for me an hour back that way, and I would give anything not to go back to it tonight. And I, who had ridden that train alone for 6 years telling myself I was a way station, heard myself say the truest and least characteristic thing I'd said in a decade. "Then don't," I said. "Not tonight. Ride to the end." Alderton's got an inn, a good one, run by a woman named Della who makes a breakfast that'll fix most of what's wrong with a person. You get a night where nobody knows you, and nobody's disappointed in you, and nobody needs you to be sorry. And in the morning, when you can feel your hands again, you decide. But you don't have to decide tonight. Tonight you're just a woman on a train, warm in a borrowed coat, going somewhere nobody can find you. She looked at me for a long moment, the snow-gray eyes searching my face like she was checking it for the catch, the price, the bill at the end. And whatever she found there, or didn't find, made her sit back and pull my coat tighter and say, in a small, steadier voice, "Okay, okay." To the end of the line, then, Gus came through for tickets a few minutes later. He took in the whole picture, the green dress, the tears not quite dry, my coat on her shoulders, and I watched him decide, in the space of one heartbeat, to be kind about it, which is the thing I have always loved about Gus. "Evening," he said to her, gentle as anything. And to me, the usual Eli, and I said yes, and he punched my ticket. And when Cora fumbled in her little beaded purse and came up pale, realizing she'd walked out of a party with no cash and a phone she was afraid to turn on, Gus said, smooth as if it were nothing, "Yours is covered, miss. Company promotion. First-time riders to the end of the line go free this month, which is not a thing that exists, which is a thing Gus invented on the spot out of pure decency. And he moved on down the car before she could argue, and Cora looked at me with her eyes filling again and said, "Is everyone out here like this?" And I said, "Mostly it's why nobody ever leaves." We talked the rest of the way. Somewhere past the third stop she stopped gripping her purse. She told me she used to play the cello seriously, conservatory seriously, and that she'd been good enough to have had a different whole life, and that somewhere in the good match and the sensible future the cello had become a thing she used to do, past tense, a girlhood hobby folded up and put in a closet, and that Preston had once introduced her at a dinner as Cora, she's very artistic, in the voice you'd use for a child's refrigerator drawing, and everyone had laughed warmly and she had laughed too, and gone home and cried and not known why. And I told her about the watches, about my Uncle Wallace and the shop and the widow's pocket watch stopped for 30 years that I was trying to bring back. And when she asked, careful, whether I lived out here alone, I told her yes. And I heard the old story starting up in my mouth, the way station story, some men are places you pass through, and for the first time in 6 years, sitting next to a woman in a green dress on the last train home, I heard how sad it was, and I didn't finish it. The train pulled into Alderton at midnight, and the platform was empty and frost-bright under a single lamp. And I walked her the 4 blocks to the Alderton Inn, and Della Marsh opened the door in her robe, without a word of complaint at the hour, because Della has been taking in strays off the last train since before I was born, and she took one look at the green dress and the borrowed coat, and she said, "Well, come in out of the cold, sweetheart. We'll sort the rest in the morning." And I understood that Cora was in better hands than mine, and I said good night, and I meant to leave. But at the door, Cora caught my sleeve. "Eli," she said, "thank you for not letting me be alone, for not asking me to be sorry." "That's the one house rule out here," I said. "You're allowed to not be sorry. Everything else is negotiable." She smiled, and it was the first smile I'd seen from her that reached all the way up, and I walked home through the frost to my rooms above the shop, and the 100 clocks were all disagreeing as usual, and for the first time in a long time the silence underneath them felt less like a fact and more like a question. She was supposed to leave in the morning. She didn't. Della's breakfast happened, and then Della mentioned that the inn's parlor had a cello in the corner that had belonged to her late husband Harlan, gathering dust these 11 years because Della couldn't bear to play it and couldn't bear to sell it, and would Cora, being musical, have a look and tell her if it was even worth anything. And Cora, who had come out to the porch with her bag packed and her phone still dark, and every intention of catching the noon train back to her sensible life and her apology, went into the parlor to look at a dead man's cello, and she picked it up, and she tuned it, and she drew the bow across it once. And she didn't catch the noon train. I know, because I'd found a reason to walk past the inn at noon and again at 2, telling myself I was checking on a customer's mantel clock in that direction, and the second time I heard it through the open window, the cello, rough and hesitant and then less hesitant, a woman remembering her own hands. And I stood on the sidewalk of my little town in the cold and listened to a stranger come back. To life through a window, and I did not go in. I just listened, and then I went back to my shop and I took out the widow's pocket watch, and I worked on it until dark. That was the beginning of the good weeks. That's how I think of them now. Cora stayed at the inn, just a few more days, she said, and then stopped saying how many. She played Harlan's cello in the evenings, and Della wept happily in the kitchen, and half the town found reasons to walk past the inn at dusk. She came into my shop on the 3rd day, and she'd traded the green dress for jeans and one of Della's cardigans, and she looked 10 years younger and about 1,000 pounds lighter, and she watched me work on the pocket watch with her chin in her hands. And she asked me about every part, and I found I could talk for hours when someone was actually listening, which was a thing I'd forgotten about myself. She started keeping me company most afternoons after that. She'd bring 2 coffees from the diner, where the owner had already started calling her the cello girl like she'd lived in Alderton her whole life. And she'd sit on the tall stool by the window, and I'd hand her the loop and let her look at the movements under magnification, all those tiny gold gears turning. And once she went quiet for a long while, looking at a watch's insides, and then said, "It's like the cello. All these small parts nobody sees, and if one of them is even a little wrong, the whole thing goes silent. And everybody just thinks the music stopped, when really it was one tired spring the whole time." And I looked at her looking at the gears, and I felt the fortress I'd lived in for 6 years lose a stone out of its wall. One evening, we walked the long way around the green, the 2 of us not touching, talking about nothing, and Gus was there on his night off sitting on the bench outside the diner. And he tipped his cap at us and said, "Evening, Eli, miss," with a smile that had a whole knowing paragraph folded inside it, and after we'd passed Cora bumped her shoulder against mine and said, "He covered my fare that night. Invented a promotion out of thin air so I wouldn't be embarrassed. I'll never forget it." And I said, "That's Gus. That's the whole town. Really, nobody out here lets you be alone in a thing if they can help it." And she was quiet a moment, and then she said, so soft I almost missed it, I noticed, and it wasn't the town she was looking at when she said it. I knew I was falling for her. I think I'd known since the cello came through the inn window, but I held it careful and quiet, because she'd walked out of one future she never chose, and the last thing on earth I wanted was to be a man reaching for her before she'd finished choosing her own. So I said nothing. I kept the coffee coming and the stool dusted and the shop warm, and I told myself being near her was enough, and it almost was. She'd turned her phone on by then. She'd called her sister Diane and had the hard conversation, and Diane had cried and then, being a better sister than Cora had given her credit for, had said, "Are you happy there?" And Cora had looked out the inn window at the frost on the green and said, "I think I'm starting to be," which was not the same as yes, but was a country mile from the woman on the train. She had not called Preston. Preston, it turned out, did not need to be called. He'd found Alderton the way determined men find things, and on a gray Saturday 2 weeks in, a car too nice for our roads came down Main Street and parked outside the inn, and I watched from my shop window, as Preston Cole got out in his good overcoat and went inside, and every animal instinct I had wanted to cross the street. But I'd learned something once, standing in my own doorway 6 years too late, so I made myself a deal at the window. If she looks for me, I go. If she doesn't, I trust her. I couldn't see the parlor. I couldn't hear it. I stood at my bench with the pocket watch in pieces and my heart going like a hammer, and I waited. And it was the longest hour of my life. And then the inn door opened and Preston came out, and he did not have Cora with him. But he didn't go to his car either. He crossed the street. He came into my shop, and the little bell over the door rang, and he stood among all my ticking clocks in his beautiful coat and looked at me with a face that was trying very hard to be reasonable. "You're the one from the train," he said. "The clock man." She told me. "Eli, that's right," I said. "She's not leaving," he said, and there was real bewilderment in it, real pain, and I'll give him this. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who'd bought a future and couldn't understand why it wouldn't stay bought. "She's giving up everything. Her family, her home, a life any sensible person would want. To play a dead man's cello in a town with one traffic light, and I think she's having some kind of breakdown, and I think you're letting her, maybe encouraging her, and I'd like to understand what exactly you believe you have to offer her." And there it was. The question landed in the exact soft place She's a Lovely Place to Visit had worn into me 6 years before. What do you have to offer her? And the old story rose up in my throat, the way station story, so fast and so familiar. Some men are places you pass through, and I opened my mouth, and what came out was, "Nothing you'd count." "Nothing," he repeated. "No," I said. "No gallery, no sensible future. No ice sculpture. I fix stopped clocks in a town nobody's heard of, and I take the last train home alone. And by your math, I've got nothing to put against you. And you're right. So I won't try. If she's better off with what you're offering, take her back. I won't stand in the way of her real life." And Preston looked at me, and something in his face eased because I'd conceded. I'd handed it to him, and he nodded and said, "I'm glad you're reasonable," and he left, the bell ringing behind him. And I stood in my shop full of other people's time and understood that I had just done the thing I always do. I had drowned slow on dry land and called it being reasonable. I had decided for her that she couldn't possibly choose me, and I dressed my own cowardice up as her freedom. Della set me straight. She came into the shop an hour later, still in her apron. And she did not pour any coffee. She just put both hands flat on my counter among the watch parts and said, "Eli Sutton." That girl has been in my parlor for an hour crying, and do you know what she said? She said the clock man agreed with Preston. She said, "Even Eli thinks I should go back." And I want to know why, in the name of everything holy. The one man in this town she trusts looked her dead in her future and told her to leave. I didn't tell her to leave, I said. I told him I wouldn't stand in the way of her real life. "This is her real life," Della said. "You lonesome fool." She turned her phone off at your suggestion and turned her whole self back on in my parlor. You didn't get in the way of her real life. You were the first person in years who got out of it. She leaned in. Your fiancé leaving all those years ago, Harlan dying on me, none of it taught you the thing it should have. So I'll say it plain because I'm old and I've buried the man I loved and I don't have patience left for slow ones. You are not a place people pass through. You're just a man who decided that first, so he'd never have to survive being left again. That girl is not going to leave, but she is going to believe you don't want her because you were too scared to say you do. Lantern night is tomorrow. The whole town will be on the green. Fix it before then, or fix nothing. But don't you dare make that beautiful, frightened girl carry your old sadness on top of her own. Lantern night in Alderton is the thing we do when November turns hard, the night the whole town comes out onto the green after dark and hangs paper lanterns in the bare trees and lights them one by one until the green glows gold against the black. 100 small warm lights where an hour before there was nothing. It is, I think, the most beautiful thing my little town does, and I had watched it alone for 6 years. Della, it turned out, had done a quiet thing. She had told the town about Cora's cello, and she had set a single chair in the middle of the green under the biggest tree, and she had asked Cora to play one song for lantern night, and Cora, terrified, had said yes, because Della is not a woman you say no to, and because some part of Cora wanted to be seen doing the thing she loved before she lost her nerve about her whole new life. I got there as the lanterns were going up, and I saw Preston's car still parked by the inn, and I saw him standing at the edge of the green in his good coat, come to make his final case, to be there reasonable and waiting when she finished, to walk her back to the sensible world. And I saw Cora sit down in the single chair under the tree with Harlan's cello, in the gold light of 100 lanterns, pale and scared, scanning the crowd. Scanning, I realized, for me. She was looking for me. And this time, I did not stay at the window. I came through the crowd to the front, to where she could see me, and when her eyes found me, the fear in them steadied into something else, and she set the bow to the strings, and she played. I don't have the words for what she played. I mend time. I don't make music. But I will tell you that the whole town went silent, and the lanterns swung a little in the cold air. And this woman who 2 weeks before had been dissolving on a midnight train poured something out of that cello that made grown men wipe their eyes and pretend it was the wind, and when the last note faded up into the bare gold trees, nobody breathed for a second. And then Alderton came apart at the seams cheering, and I saw Preston at the edge of the light. Understand at last that he had already lost, that you cannot buy a future from a woman who has just remembered she has her own. And then Cora stood up, and she did not look at Preston. She looked at me. And in front of the whole town and the 100 lanterns and God, I crossed the green and I stopped in front of her, close as that first seat on the train, and I said the thing I'd swallowed my whole cowardly life. I told Preston I had nothing to offer you, I said, and it was the truest lie I ever told. Because here's what I actually have. I've got a shop full of clocks and a town with one light and a last train I've ridden alone for 6 years telling myself I was a place people pass through. And I've got this, the thing I was too scared to say in the shop, that I don't want you to go back to your real life, because this is your real life, and I'm in it. And I would rather have you here choosing this small gold town every day than be reasonable one more minute of my life. Don't go because I got quiet and let you think I didn't want you. I want you. Stay, Cora. Not pretend. For real. She was crying, and so was I, in front of everybody, and she said, "On the train I asked if you'd mind pretending we were together." "I remember," I said. "I don't want to pretend anymore," she said, and she put down the bow and she crossed the last of the distance, and there was no seat and no searcher and no borrowed coat between us, just 100 lanterns and a town holding its breath. And when I kissed her, the whole green erupted, and somewhere in it I heard Della's sharp, happy whistle, and Gus, who'd come out on his night off just for this, laughing that cello laugh, and Preston's nice car starting up and pulling quietly away down Main Street, going back to a sensible world that had just lost the only artistic thing it ever undervalued. We didn't rush the rest. We'd both learned the hard way what happens when you build fast, or when you don't build at all. Cora stayed at Della's through the winter respectably and played that cello every evening, and half the town made a habit of walking past the inn at dusk to hear it. She started teaching the Alderton kids. Badly at first, and then well. And there are 9 children in my town now who can hold a bow because a woman ran the wrong way down a train platform one November night. In the spring, she moved her things into the rooms above the shop, where 100 clocks disagree about the time, and one voice, hers, agrees with mine about the only things that matter. And the widow's pocket watch, the 1898 railroad watch, stopped 30 years. I finished it that same winter. found the one small tired part that had given out and made it new, and it ticks now on the mantel above where Cora plays, keeping perfect time, a thing that stopped and was told it was done, and turned out to only be waiting for the right hands. I ask her, sometimes, late, in the dark, whether she ever thinks about how it might not have happened. If she'd caught a different train. If she'd sat in a different seat. If I'd been the man I was for 6 years and frozen instead of taking off my coat. And she says she thinks about it every time she hears a train in the night. But she doesn't think it was luck. I didn't sit next to a stranger, she told me once. I sat next to the only person in that car who looked like he'd understand a person at the edge of themselves. I think I knew before I asked. The pretending was just how I got brave enough to be real. I think about that out in the shop, holding a stopped watch up to the light, listening for the fault. About how the things we think are finished are so often only waiting. She sat down beside me on the last train home and asked me to pretend, and we stopped pretending, and she stayed, and I'll spend the rest of my life grateful for a cold November night and a woman brave enough to run the wrong way. So here's what I've got for you. If you've ridden this far with a quiet man, if there's a train you keep meaning to catch, a phone you keep too scared to turn back on, a stopped thing in you that everybody including you has written off as done, this is me telling you from the far side of nearly missing my whole life to my own held breath. Turn it on, catch it, wind it back up. You have no idea what's only been waiting for the right hands. I almost let mine ride away in a nice car because I was too reasonable to say 4 words out loud. Don't be as slow as I was. And if you'd stay a while longer with us, subscribe and let the next story keep you company. There's always a warm light on here at Lamplight, and the kettle's on, and somewhere down the line I promise you the last train is still running.